Hello, and after we set up our database that is ready for connections, we will be writing some Python code and starting to learn SQL Alchemy. Let's call this lesson 1. So I have created Python file. And let's learn how to connect to our database. So there are different ways you can connect to your database, but I'll be showing you one option of how to do that, of how I do that, and which works fine in all of my projects. So, in order to connect to our database, we will be needing SQL Alchemy engine. So it's basically an engine that will be powering our connections. So we need to create this variable engine equals to create engine. It's really simple, engine, and you can see the Copilot is suggesting me to connect to SQLite, how to pronounce that database, but no, we will be using not SQLite. We need to import that, and we are going to import from SQL Alchemy, just straight from SQL Alchemy. And here we need to provide connection arguments. We need to provide connection arguments. We can do this multiple ways, but we can just use URL, which is a connection string, and it usually looks like that. Format is driver, then colon, 2 slashes, user, colon, password, at host, colon, port, slash DB name. So it's database name. But you don't need to remember that. We have this thing, URL. Let's call it URL and write URL in capital letters. And let's import it from SQL Alchemy again. And we create a URL instance. And here we just provide driver name, username, password, host, port, database as an arguments, which is quite convenient. As a driver name, we use PostgreSQL, and we specify which library we will be using, which is psycopg. Username will be test user, the one we created with the Docker. The password will be test password. As a host, we can just write localhost because we are connecting to the local database. A port will be 5432, the standard port for Postgres. The database name will be test user. And that's it. And actually, because we are using a URL builder, we need to create this URL not as an instance, but as a create method. And here we will be writing this thing. So we are creating a URL connections. And in the engine, we need to pass this URL, just passing URL. Also, we can specify 2 arguments, whether we want to include the logs. So if we want to see what's happening during our queries, yeah, we want to include echo. And I don't think we need to use future here because we are already using the 2.0 style. So no future needed. So yeah, we have our engine, but the engine is not actually a connection. It will power our connections, but it's not a connection. And to create a connection in which we will be running our queries, we need a session. But we don't want to have this session once created and that's it. We want to, in our app, we will be needing a session pool, which is a pool of connections which will be connecting to our database multiple times and having these connections established all the time, the multiple connections. And whenever we need a session, it will just retrieve the session from the session pool and then run some queries and then return back this session. So if different people will be using our app, there will be one session retrieved from the pool, used, and then returned back. And this is really efficient to use connection-wise. And in order to create a session pool, we will be using Session Maker. Well, to be honest, Session Maker in SQL Alchemy is not actually creating session pool itself, but it creates a factory function that can generate new connections. And SQL Alchemy sessions are designed to serve as a primary point of interaction between your application and database. And each session is focused on managing the state and transactions of objects within that session. However, session typically obtains a connection from a connection pool underneath, and connection pooling is managed by engine, which is separate from the session maker. But when you create an engine, when you instantiate the engine, it does not create a connection pool associated with it. However, the connections in the pool are not instantiated right away. Instead, they are lazily allocated on a as needed basis. So when you need this connection, it will create it actually, and there's limits and you can increase the limit. So basically you have a soft limit of connections that you establish and they are created when they are needed up to this limit, but you can also have an overhead of connections that will be destroyed. So for example, you could have 20 connections that will be keeping all the time, and up to 200 connections that from 20 to 200, these ones will be destroyed when they are not needed. So when your application first requests a connection, the engine will create this new connection and hand it over to your session. And as more connections are required, the engine will continue to allocate new connections once it reaches the maximum pool size established. Function, which will be imported from the SQL Alchemy.orm. And here we will be specifying our engine, which we created above. And also we can do other things, like if we want to use a synchronous session, we can provide a class as a synchronous session. But actually in the version 2.0, we have a sync session maker. And here it is, a sync session maker, but we are not going to use it right now. So we have created an engine and we have created a session pool. And if we need to retrieve a session from the session pool, we can do it with two ways. Just retrieving it, session, by using a call method here. And we will be having this session prepared for us. We can run some queries like execute, like commit, and then we need to run the session close method. Return the session back into the session pool. We can go to the definition and we can see what it is doing. Close out the transactional resources and ORM objects used by this session. And the SQL Alchemy will understand that it needs to return it to the session pool. But we are not going to use this way because we are going to use a context manager. The same thing you might have used with the files when you need to open the file and then close the file. And because of that, in order to do this properly, you are using with open for files, and we are using with session pool. We run call as session, and whenever this code is completed, the session pool will be closed automatically. And of course, if we are using a session pool, a synchronous session pool, we will be needing here a sync with session pool, but it is not asynchronous right now. We are just using session pool. And if you're familiar with SQL, you can run session commit, session rollback, and other methods you can find here. But we will be covering some of them later. And let's put some example code here. Session execute, and to run a simple SQL queries, the textual queries, you can use text function from SQL Alchemy, SQL Alchemy text. And here we are just selecting one, and we don't need to run commit. And let's run this lesson. And you can see here the logs that it has began a transaction, executed select one, and then made rollback. So it has successfully connected to our database and ran some code. But if we have made a mistake in our password, we would get an error like here. Sorry, I cannot make this larger for some reason, but it is written here that connection to server localhost failed, and the description that password authentication failed for user test user. So if I made a mistake, it would not run. So basically, here our code is correct, and that's important. So now you know how to connect to your database with SQL Alchemy.